When people ask me, I'm getting started in woodworking, what are the top tools I should buy? A router is always really close to the top of the list. And there are a bunch of reasons for it. They're very, very versatile tools. We can use them handheld, like we're gonna right now. You can also put a good router in a router table and use it that way for even more options. So it's something that you add this to your arsenal of tools, and there are so many things that we can do with it. But of course, we wanna make sure that you're using it the way it should get used. So let's go over some handheld router basics. Today we're using the Bora router, and this would more specifically be a handheld fixed base router. Handheld because we currently have the base on it, so we can do this. Fixed based, meaning that it's not a plunge router, it's a fixed base router. So when I loosen the wing nut back here, that allows me to make adjustments. That's on a screw thread. So that's raising or lowering the motor relative to the workbench. Then when I do that, it's in a fixed position. That's why it's called a fixed base router. One of the things I like looking for on a router is variable speed. So we'll plug in here, get some hearing protection going. So with variable speed, the thing you really have to pay attention to is as your bit diameter changes, it's not unlikely that you also have to change speed. When you go to a larger diameter bit, you have to be able to slow this down. Additionally, you'll find if you mess with that variable speed that you can increase your cut quality by changing the speed at which you're running the router. So here's what we've got. On switch, and then basically like a dimmer dial here, like you'd have on a light, and you'll hear the speed ramp up and down. So again, you got to remember, large diameter bit, lower RPM, look at the speed chart that we've given you in the description that goes with the video. You got to follow the rules of the road on that speed chart. Business end of the router. The shaft of the motor will accept what's called a router collet. And very commonly, you can get these in 1/2 inch and in 1/4 inch. You really want to have both. You want to have that option. And whenever possible, default to 1/2 inch shank bits. Some bits are not available in 1/2 inch shank, so that's why you want to also have the 1/4 inch collet available. That's going to snap into the collet nut. That's the collet nut. And then we're going to do some edge forming first. So I'm going to put in my edge forming bit. Of course, all this is done with the router unplugged to make sure that nothing can happen here. When you put the router bit in, this is really critical. You want to not be in too far, and you want to be not in far enough. You don't want to not be in far enough. General rule of thumb is 2/3 of the shank should be in the collet, about there. Then we'll tighten this down. And it doesn't take a come along to get this tight enough. So here, a little bit of a squeeze there, and that's all the oomph you need to properly hold that bit in place. Then, we talked about this earlier, this is on a screw thread, so you can see as I do this, I can get more or less router bit sticking out. The way to approach this depth of cut is it's better to do a number of light passes than to try to hog all your material off in one pass. So what I would generally do is an initial pass to get some material off, maybe a second pass. On my final pass, I want that to be the lowest percentage of material removal. So a way to think about it would be, if I'm taking off 100%, I'm getting to the profile I want. I want to do something like 45%, 45%, 10%. So that very last pass is really light, and that's going to really optimize my surface finish. What we're getting ready to do is do that edge forming on this board. And one of the things you don't want is the board running away from you. Router pads are indispensable for this. And the way that works, very simple. It's like a drawer liner. The board will sit on there. And then now, when I have lateral pressure on it from the router, it's not going to be able to slide around the workbench on me. And I don't have to put a clamp on here that as I work my way around I have to move. So it's very, very convenient. Anytime you're routing all 4 edges, we want to do end grain first, long grain, end grain, long grain. And the reason for that is that as we come across the end grain and we exit, it's possible we get a little bit of a chip there. When we follow that with a long grain cut, we're going to clean that up automatically. Then we do end grain. If we get a little chip, then it'll automatically clean up when we do the long grain. So sequence is important. Handling is important. Don't turn the router on up here in space. Get the router on your work. And there's a bearing on that router bit. The bearing is going to ride against the edge of our material. That's what controls our lateral cut. So here, I'm finding the edge of the work with the bearing, and then I'm going to remove it from the work. I don't want the bearing touching the wood when I turn this on. Once the router is running, then I'll come against my material, move, 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 move. Now the move. Direction of feed is really, really, really important. All routers spin clockwise. When we're using a tool, we want to feed against the direction of rotation. So on the outside of this piece, the router spins clockwise. We're going to go around that counterclockwise. If it ever feels like a router is self-propelled, you're going the wrong direction. You're going the same direction as the bit, and that's pulling the router along. It's very unsafe. It's called climb cutting. So again, we're going to feed around this way. Once the router's running, contact, move, work my way around. Hearing protection and safety glasses. Routers are loud. With a bit this diameter, we'll be able to run at full speed on this router. Turning up my speed. So just watch everything that we just talked about. Contact, lose contact. Now, one thing to notice is I shut the router off, it's still there. So the router is on my work when I turn it on. It stays on my work until it comes to a complete stop. Then I do this. Let's talk about what you just saw. So one, with the way a router is set up, if I come away from the edge just a little bit as I'm cutting, you might leave a little high spot. I've got one right there. No harm, no foul. All I have to do is start the router again, come back to that spot, pass over it again, and I can clean that up. So with the bearing on the bit and the depth of cut on the router, you can't take off too much material. It's impossible. But it's possible if it moves away from the edge, you've not taken enough. The other thing you may have noticed is that I talked about go counterclockwise all the way around. But when I came here to this corner, I backed up just a little bit, and then I continued the cut. So the deal with that is that I come across the end grain, and it's kind of impossible to remain in contact, the ball bearing, with the edge and come around the corner. So I come across the edge, I can feel the bearing lose contact with the material. I come back in, just a tiny bit in from that corner, back up a 1/4 inch, 3/8 of an inch, then engage that edge and go all the way across. And that's the best way to do that. So all I'd have to do is fire up the router. I could clean that up. Now that's edge forming. I also want to show you dadoing with a router bit. So need to change my setup just a little bit, and then we'll look at dadoing. I've got a spot marked out on my board, and I want a dado right there. This jig provides such a simple way to do dados. You got to make one of these. Here's what we've got. The spine of the jig right here, the fence, is a piece that does need to be perfectly straight because the base of the router is going to follow that. It's going to trace it. This is currently too big. It's just 1/4 inch plywood glued to the bottom of that 1x2. Now what's about to happen is I'm going to clamp this to the edge of my bench, and I'm going to allow the base of the router to run here. That router bit is going to cut through the base. All going to make a lot more sense in just a second. Here's what that gives us. That edge was cut by that bit. So it shows me exactly where the router bit is. Now that I have this line, all I need to do is place the jig right on that line, and that's where the dado is going to get cut. So this is great for cutting dados, and one of the benefits to it is we don't have to do a dado that's square to an edge like this one. We can easily do an angled dado. We can also use this to trim an end. So if you had a really long piece of something you couldn't handle on a miter saw and a circ saw cut wouldn't be good enough and your table saw is not going to do it, we could cut to length using your router. So this and this. Depth is already set. And that puts that dado right smack on the pencil line. Now, I want to show you one other thing that's really cool. And I want to point this out because I know people run into this. This being, router's now unplugged. Let's take that bit out. Now right now that collet nut is loose, but there's a good chance your router bit still doesn't want to come out of there. This is a two-stage deal. You got to make both stages happen. This is called a self-releasing collet. So when I continue to turn the nut, it's going to pull the collet free of the shaft of the motor. So right now that bit's still in there firmly, but do this, this, give that another little, now watch, comes right out. So take advantage of that self-releasing collet. Don't make work out of this. Like I said, the router is such a versatile tool, edge forming, joinery, cutting stuff to length, easy jig to make. Great way to add lots of different cool stuff to your woodworking.